All right, welcome back in Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall, a live look at the White House, where it's approaching 8 p.m. in the nation's capital, a few minutes away from 8 p.m., I should say. Let's talk about the latest news coming from the White House, especially as it relates to the Russia-Ukraine war. President Trump announcing on Friday that he has ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions following what they call highly provocative statements made by former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev said earlier this week that Trump's new deadline for Russia to end the conflict with Ukraine is an additional step toward war. Trump posting this on social media, saying, based on the highly provocative statements of the former president of Russia, Medvedev, who is now the deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, I have ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions just in case these foolish and inflammatory statements are more than just that. Words are very important and can often lead to unintended consequences. I hope this will not be one of those instances. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Hal Kempfer is here. Hal, let's just get to the point here. Is this a big deal?
You know, it's interesting. It is and it isn't. The big deal is that we're actually talking about positioning nuclear submarines. That's something we just don't talk about ever. It's called the silent service for a reason. We don't talk about where we're putting our nuclear subs. We don't talk about where we're sending our nuclear subs with nuclear missiles. And they're called boomers. And I should mention that he didn't say boomers. He didn't say nuclear weapons, armed submarines. He just said nuclear submarines. All of our attack submarines are technically nuclear submarines. So certainly everybody's reading into it. You know, it's like, oh, we're putting our nuclear, inferring that we're putting our nuclear missile armed submarines or boomers in position to attack Russia should we need to. But he didn't say he was putting them in position necessarily to attack Russia. He just said they're putting them in their appropriate positions or appropriate areas. Again, one could look at that and read into it many different things. What do you mean by appropriate areas? Are they close to Russia? Are they not close to Russia? Is this any different than were they in inappropriate areas before? So there's a lot of ways to look at this, but the fact the president even used this type of language, it's a little bit new. And some would say a little bit escalatory, if you will. But certainly Dmitry Medvedev's just over-the-top rhetoric that he's had constantly, where he is the nuclear saber rattler. I mean, he has been, every time he turn around, he's saying something about their nuclear arsenal and remember we're a nuclear armed nation and blah, blah, blah. And anyway, so I find it interesting that he's kind of getting for the first time sort of the same thing that he's been putting out. And I find the choice of words to be rather interesting. And certainly the first time that a president of the United States has said something quite like this in response to certainly what Medvedev has been saying.
For some background, Hal, Trump said on Monday that he's giving Putin 10 to 12 days to stop the killing in Ukraine. That shortened a 50-day deadline that he had given the Russian leader 2 weeks ago. Hal, what happens if Putin doesn't stop fighting? What if the killing doesn't stop before Trump's deadline? What happens then?
Well, that's an interesting situation. And if I was to put money on it today, I'd say he's probably not going to stop fighting. I would be very surprised. But what can happen, as you saw, India is getting a 35% tariff put on it. Potentially, if everything was put in place with the legislation that has a lot of bipartisan support, and President Trump has indicated he would be willing to sign, if all that is put into place, it gives him the ability to put a very large secondary tariff on Russian oil. About 40% of the imported oil that India gets comes from Russia. That's significant. Before the war started, it was about 1%. So that gives you an idea of how important that is. They've been buying up that cheap oil. India is kind of giving signs that they've got other sources for that oil. If Russia loses India as a market for its oil, that's going to be a huge hit on Russian revenues. And then China is the other country. They buy a lot of Russian oil too. I think China is going to be a little bit tougher to work that through in terms of, the secondary tariffs and having Xi put pressure onto Russia and some other things. But India looks like that could happen pretty quick should that occur. And that goes into Russia's ability to pay for the war. That goes into Russia's ability to raise revenue to pay for the military, to pay for everything they're doing. And that would significantly degrade Russia's ability to continue this war at the same level. And Russia's already got major economic problems. It's sliding down hills. And this would basically give it a big shove downhill economically. What will that do in Russia? That's the big question. Would that cause, what we've been waiting for, which is some sort of level of civil unrest in Moscow and St. Petersburg? That's the big question.
And I'll piggyback off of that. If pressure on the Kremlin isn't working so far, what does history tell us about what type of pressure does work on the Kremlin, if any?
Well, actually, if you go back historically to the Soviet Union, it was actually the failing economy that really was two things. Well, one was the failing economy. The other one was that the much vaunted Russian military machine, which was a machine that was basically used by Iraq during Desert Storm, Russian tactics, Russian doctrine, Russian equipment, Russian everything except it was Iraqis. The U.S. and its allies just went through that, Russian or that Soviet military machine by proxy, if you will, like a hot knife through butter. I mean, it didn't even slow down. And all of a sudden, people are like, this one institution that we believe in the Soviet Union, its capabilities are now ones that we can't believe in. And the Russian economy was already going downhill fast and was going downhill faster. And they were watching at the time the, basically the Warsaw Pact falling apart and all these basic dictators, if you will, the Warsaw Pact countries falling apart. And all of that had cumulative mass. And suddenly the Soviet Union, something that really no one foresaw just collapsed. And if you go back, if you look at that, and then you look back at 1917 and the few years before it, you see, it's all of a sudden there forever. And then, as they say about dictators and autocrats, they seem like they're going to be there forever until the last 5 minutes, and then they're gone. And that's kind of what people are foreseeing with this, which is Putin looks like he's going to be there forever. He hasn't, nobody has succumbed to the pressure put on Russia yet. Although I would say if you look back historically, it'll be just something that builds up. And when it falls, it will probably fall very fast and everyone will be caught a little bit by surprise.
President Trump was asked about these nuclear subs while he was in a press gaggle outside the White House earlier today. Let's listen.
Where are the submarines being deployed? The nuclear submarines?
Say it?
Where are being deployed the nuclear submarines?
Oh, yeah. Well, we had to do that. We just have to be careful. And a threat was made, and we didn't think it was appropriate, so I have to be very careful. So I do that on the basis of safety for our people. A threat was made by a former president of Russia, and we're going to protect our people.
Mr. President,
can you give us any more information on the nuclear subs? And what did Medvedev say to you that made you really mad?
Well, you just have to read what he said. He was talking about nuclear. When you talk about nuclear, we have to be prepared, and we're totally prepared.
Your reaction?
My reaction is he's not saying much, except he's saying, and it's true. If you talk about nuclear, you got to be prepared and you got to be serious. The thing with Medvedev is he's not just some former president. All right. He was kind of like Putin's number two for a long time. In fact, when Putin stepped out of being president for a few years in order to basically stay in sync with the Constitution at that time in Russia, he took over as president. Putin dropped down to prime minister. I think he did like 4 years, and then boom, they went right back to where it was before. But Medvedev is still there. He's part of the Putin regime, if you will, not in the highest level position, but is still in a significant position. And he has been, many would say, Putin's mouthpiece. He says things that Putin would like to say, but Putin can't say, if you will. Although many have speculated that he may be Putin's mouthpiece, and there might be a little vodka involved at times, because sometimes he says stuff, and I have to tell you, it doesn't quite make sense. But anyway, so everyone you listen to him, and this is the first time that the White House, any White House, has responded quite this way outside of really a major crisis. I mean, I have to go back to almost the Cuban Missile Crisis to find something parallel this.
So here's the million-dollar question. What does this mean for ceasefire talks? We've been talking endlessly about maybe are we getting a little bit closer? Could there be more meetings between U.S. officials? And by the way, I should bring this up. Our understanding is that Steve Witkoff is either en route, maybe you know, Hal. My understanding is that Witkoff has a trip to Russia, and it was after he visited Gaza. He has now visited Gaza. Our understanding is he's either on the way to Russia, maybe he's already there. My question for you, though, where do ceasefire talks stand at this hour?
Well, right now, there's really nothing going on. The last ceasefire talks they had, I think they lasted a grand total of 40 minutes.
Yeah.
They worked out an exchange of POWs, but that was about all that came out of that. And part of this is really it's a pressure campaign by the White House and others to put as maximum pressure, if you will, on Putin and Russia to get them to seriously sit down and start talking about this. Right now, Putin, in his own mind, he thinks he's winning. They're making very, very marginal gains on the ground. I mean, they're moving at a glacial pace, a snail's pace, and they're taking horrendous casualties, somewhere between 800 to 2,000 or more troops lost every day. Most of them killed, a lot of them, seriously wounded, with disabling wounds, and you just can't keep up that pace forever. I know Russia has kind of this myth that they have an endless supply of manpower and they can just keep throwing people out that. And that was kind of the myth that came out of World War II, that they could do that. But at some point that ends. And I would point out in World War I, when basically the Tsarist Russia, and then more importantly, the Bolshevik, or not the Bolsheviks, but the Mensheviks that preceded the Bolsheviks, the big thing that happened on the line was that some of the troops turned and killed their officers. They just refused orders because they said, this is senseless slaughter. You're sending us to our death. And they killed their officers. Well, we're starting to see that on the lines in Ukraine. That has been happening. They've killed their officers. They don't go back to Russia. In this case, they were surrendering en masse to the Ukrainians. That was actually a safer option for them. But we're starting to see that. And frankly, with the losses that they're suffering now, I kind of wonder at what point is it enough? The tactics have been getting dumber, and their losses have becoming greater, and I just wonder when that's going to switch.
We have to talk about the Middle East as well. Before we do that, let's hit a quick commercial break. It's not every day we see Americans visiting Gaza. We did see that today, Hal. We're going to discuss in 2 minutes.